All right. So now we're going to be talking about the mega regions and the generations. Start that discussion, and I'm going to just call up Peter Gertler from HNTB and Mike Alexander from the Atlanta Regional Commission. Come on up.
Morning, everybody. Just picking up on what Chris was saying, that we have to, rather than advocating for high-speed rail as we all do, why don't we start from the beginning and justify, is there really a need for high-speed rail? And I think we're going to have a very exciting and interesting panel discussion by Mike that I'm very honored to be able to introduce. And he's going to present some of the socioeconomic and demographic trends that could justify our support and future investment in rail. I've had an opportunity to glimpse his presentation, which is really exciting to look at and something different. I think you're all going to enjoy it. So please join me in welcoming Mike Alexander, who's going to give us a discussion today on shifting mega regions and generations. Mike is the director of ARC, which is the Atlanta Regional Commission's Center for Livable Communities, which includes community development, community partnerships, natural resources, and also transportation and accessibility. He has over 20 years of public policy experience. He received dual master's degrees in city planning and public administration from Auburn University, and we appreciate his service as a marine infantryman in Desert Storm. So join me in welcoming Michael for an exciting presentation.
I told you I wasn't a demographer, and nobody would believe me. We did put some data together. I try to be very honest with our data. We did this work clean. We had some staff people put together some national data sets just for you. All the maps you're going to see were made just for this presentation, so I hope you get a kick out of them. It's kind of our brain, our think tank thinking about how this stuff looks, especially at the U.S. scale, but we've got some global stuff as well. And I do like to talk about demographics and demography. I'll use the word one more time to really get at this idea of what's real growth potential on this planet. Where are we really heading? We had a good conversation last night about demographics and what that really means. Everybody's so focused on generations. I can do that. Chris Brady is clearly a baby boomer. Look at his hair color. And you know that for sure just by the age of his kids. But I don't emphasize generations as much as I do just some very simple stuff that's baked into the way we think about growth, births, deaths, migration. The core stuff that really tells us what's likely to happen. So I pulled this from McKinsey just for you because I love the way they explained it, because I think this boils it down. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I hope you look at it later. There's going to be big winners. There's going to be big losers. And when I think about the way Amazon has gotten metropolitan areas to compete against themselves, Amazon represents the truth of this statement up on the screen, right? So we can't expect all of the U.S. to grow, and the way we're going to grow in the future is going to be slightly different, and it's really going to mean metropolitan areas are just going to take it to a whole nother level. And that really makes a lot of sense for the way you're thinking about your high-speed rail network and how it's going to connect up, right? Because when the Census Bureau does projections, those projections, and that's by the year the projection was made, continue to go down. So the last set they made, there are going to be 32 million fewer people in the U.S., right? And that's the way this stuff is going. Well, why? So the easiest way I've found to describe why this is happening is this chart. So there's two axes, life expectancy and total fertility rate, which is babies per woman. The year is actually 1800. The bubbles are countries. The size of the bubble is total population. The color coding is by continent. So I'm going to hit play here in a second, and it's going to roll through time, and you're going to see these bubbles move. Now, I've got a bunch of these bubble videos, so I'm going to explain this one, but the rest of them I won't, because you'll understand how this actually works. So I'm going to hit play, and you're going to see. The first thing I always point out, there's going to be a civil war in China in the 1850s. So that'll show you life expectancy falling. So watch the big bubble, which is China. Look at the U.S., right? And so here we go with China. The U.S. Civil War is about to happen. And then we're going to start to industrialize on this planet. People are going to move off the farm, so the life expectancy is going to increase slightly, but the fertility rate is going to start to fall. And the biggest single demographic event on this planet was actually the Spanish influenza after World War II, which took every country down on this planet, right? Then we're going to have World War II. All the other countries are Europe. so their life expectancy is going to fall dramatically. And then after the war, things get much better on this planet. So you're going to see all these countries. Here comes the Chinese one-child policy. Right? And so in the space of 218 years, over a couple thousand years of history, we've seen the biggest change in the demographic outlook for humans, right? And wow, clapping even. Yeah, so I could put up a bunch of numbers. I told you if I can't explain anything, I'll try to entertain you a little bit along the way. But there's a simple fact. We're living twice as long, and we're having dramatically fewer children. Dramatically fewer children. And that dramatic number for the U.S., and this is actually state of Georgia numbers, but it's similar for the whole U.S., is that almost all races and ethnicities, including Hispanic, are now close to or below replacement birth level. So you can't expect to grow by natural increase. And so we're going to get older. I'm sorry, Japan. It's coming. So this is, look at the vertical bar. Obviously the years off to the left, different type of chart. So these lines are going to go forward, and it's going to be the change in share of people over the age of 60. So watch what's going to happen. So we're starting in 1950, 60s, 70s. Italy's already starting to get old. Here comes low fertility in Japan. Japan gets dramatically older than everyone else, but there's the one-child Chinese policy because now we're out in the forecast. Even Mexico is going to have a higher share of older people. And this is way out into the forecast, right? A lot can happen in 60 years. But clearly you see these basic demographic components have a dramatic impact on the age composition of countries, in particular Japan. When we talk about Japan and their GDP rate and how it's compared to other fast-growing places, Japan's GDP necessarily is going to be less because of these simple demographic facts. And so I pulled this just for you guys from that McKinsey report to show you, you can't expect rural migration in large numbers to feed the growth of metropolitan areas, right? You remember that quote I had at the beginning? And here's the result, that the net result for Japan for the next 10 years, 15 to 25, is basically a zero growth rate because they're not pulling as many people from rural areas. And that similar trend for the US is also there. So you have to think about this. And when I show you the maps in a few seconds, this chart in particular will make a lot more sense. So we expect slower urban population growth. And generally speaking, if you're thinking about high-speed rail, the amount of growth in urban areas is going to be very critical to you, right? And so one of the things that's happened even more quickly than we expected is actual white population decline in this country, right? So if you look at those red numbers in the bottom, that happened 7 years earlier than we thought, right? So our largest population, our white population, will still be our largest population in the future, but it's already declining because of those first charts I already showed you. And so when you think about metropolitan places and race and ethnicity, I try to get as many places as I can. That way I've got everybody represented. And I apologize that it's so complicated. I hope you look at it later on your own computers. But all you have to do is look at Pittsburgh and then look at Los Angeles, right? So places that have high shares of white majorities, their growth rates are fundamentally different from places that are more diverse. And I'm going to show you that in just a second. So what's been happening over the last 8 years? Look at Pittsburgh. Vibrant economy, low unemployment, it's doing quite well, but it's not really growing. It's not really growing, and it's these other demographic facts that are driving that. But the Houstons and the Dallases have been on a tear, right? And so I was thinking about it, and this map is more for me than for you. You know a lot more about this stuff than I do, but just to put into context, ESRI published a global map of population density. So I cut apart at the same scales these metropolitan areas just so you could get a feel for the intensity of population density in that belt in Japan compared to the Northeast, where you can barely see Washington, D.C., and then compare it. And it's a fun way to visualize. Man, there are just a lot of people, 81 million people in a very small area in Japan, so obviously it's going to serve. So this sets a tone for the maps that are going to be coming up soon to show you how we expect that growth to happen. So if you think about U.S. regions, and this is Woods and Pool forecast data, the Southeast, which includes Florida and Georgia, North Carolina and Virginia, relatively big states, are expected long-term to add the most people. That's the net change in population from 18 to 50. So the Southeast is expected to add 32 million people. And you would contrast that from the Northeast, where those numbers are relatively small. So good numbers to have in the back of your mind about the relative potential. And Woods and Poole is a relatively optimistic forecast series. So take that with a grain of salt, that these are pretty optimistic numbers from our perspective. Right, so let's look at how states have been growing. This is where I got fancy with my video making. So you can see New York is in green, Pennsylvania and Illinois. The year is actually 1900. So how have states grown, to give you a relative picture of that over time? And so the first thing I always point out is we discovered oil in the Great Depression. So California is going to start to take off and just really blow past everyone. 1970, we start using air conditioning. So the South becomes habitable. And you see Florida and Texas taking off. Without that air conditioning, I think these growth rates would be fundamentally different. I'm not kidding. So you can see Texas and Florida, New York just holding still, right? And there's no stopping California. There's an old John Prine song. He says, 50 million Elvis fans can't all be wrong, right? There's a reason why California is so popular. So you can see the differences in these relative state growth rates. So you can see I'm going from the US down to the states. We're going to go down to mega regions and metropolitan areas. So when you see me play these videos from mega regions, this is something AMPO put together. There's a lot of different ways to categorize mega regions. So if you think there should be 2 more or 3, I apologize for that. Today we're going to use 11. And you can see that I've got Cascadia. Where's my Cascadia planner? She's covered today. So you can see this. So just so you understand what these are, take a second to look at that, because I've got bubble videos for these as well. We took all that Woods and Poole data, reformed it so that we can look at the growth rates for these mega regions, which I think is a lot of fun. Right? So there's your proposed high-speed rail network, just so you can see the linkages and the cities that are represented, because we made MSA data for all that as well, just for you. And so if you look at the MSA growth rates, you can see, relatively speaking, the Midwest is where we see very little growth in this Woods and Poole forecast data. But the core of your network is represented in those big purple numbers, where we expect millions of more people in these metropolitan statistical areas, right? But the real trick is the counties. Are the counties growing near or in the core? Are we expecting exurban or suburban growth? So I know this is complicated, because what I did was I took county level population change and I overlaid it on top of those mega regions. And then I realized this map was illegible. So I took so now I'm just showing you the counties that are expected to lose population in the Woods and Poole forecast data. I keep saying Woods and Poole forecast because I want you to say, Mike, your numbers. No, not my numbers, Woods and Poole numbers. But again, that's a huge area. And so when I talk at the front end about not expecting rural migration to feed metropolitan areas, you've got to have in the back of your mind high death rates, low birth rates. We don't have a lot of people to migrate out of these places that are already declining by natural decrease, right? People no longer with us. So don't look to these areas to be the engine for metropolitan areas, right? So this is a critical map to understand what the real potential is. So the next map is counties that are growing, and where are those counties really located spatially compared to the core of the MSAs where your rail network actually links up. And you can see there's a pretty good fit. There's a pretty good fit there, because these are the areas that we know are economically capturing most of the growth in the United States. So when you drill that down, you can see those red and purples and oranges, very much the areas where that network would be critically served and linked up. So you should feel pretty good about that. But in the back of my mind is 81 million people in that Japanese corridor. That's a heck of a lot of people when you look at the population of California, right? Over double the population of California. So just once again, that population change for you. And you guys obviously have all these maps now. It's a lot of fun. I love making maps like that. So thank you It's fun for us. So let's watch these mega regions now. Let's look at the total mega region growth. ROUS is the rest of the US, but you can see California blowing by everybody. And I didn't do this just for Chris and the Texas rail people, but you can see Texas is so strong in this forecast. Piedmont Atlantic is obviously where I live in Georgia, and then Florida. But then the rest of the mega regions, relatively slow growth compared to the big ones. But if you think about it, it's pretty incredible that, you know, the Northeast is growing as much or more than the whole rest of the United States outside of these mega region areas. So a lot of fun. And then I did do this, I did a share of 65 plus. Obviously Florida is much older. This one's going to be a little bumpy. There's no way around it given the way the numbers are generated. So let's see how we are aging at the mega region scale. So you can see Florida already, you know, at 20% over 65, even right at that even in the 1990s. But here comes Chris Brady hitting those old age groups here now. And you can see across the US, there's no denying the baby boomers, and then actually my generation, Generation X now, turning 65. So even most of these mega regions, you're going to be at least 1 in 5 people are going to be over 65, right? So that's my joke when I'm out speaking in Atlanta. My daughters can major in anything they want as long as it's biomedical engineering, because there's going to be a lot of hip replacements in this country, people. So let's look at metro growth real fast. I did want to show this just to give you a scale for, in particular, you're going to see Dallas and Houston. There's no way around the force that is Texas right now. So I hope you guys can see this, because it's really New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, but you're going to see how the Sun Belt metros come on really fast. And I don't color code them all. The top 50 largest metros are in this data set. So if you ever want to get this data from me and try to make your own Gapminder tools, I'm happy to send it to you. But you can see Dallas and Houston really coming out of the pack. So the mega metros, the New Yorks and the Chicagos, they will always be our largest places, but you can expect a heck of a lot of growth, especially in this Texas area, and that's fun to look at as well. And so again, just for a clear understanding on the other side, the places we're going to expect the most growth are the places that have high shares of children right now, or relatively young, newer households, because they're more likely to have children. That's why the Pittsburghs, where you don't have a high share of young families, aren't likely to grow. So you can see how relatively old the Northeast is, and of course Florida, which is its own particular growth animal, but relatively speaking, the Southeast and the Midwest and the Far West are generally younger. All right, and so we were talking a little bit earlier about housing costs. We are thinking a lot about it at the ARC, because what you have to grapple with is how much growth can we put in as close proximity to the core of different metropolitan areas as possible. So housing costs for all of us are very critical. We were studying San Diego last year, and San Diego looked at all the Metro Atlanta leaders and said, you know, you have a housing problem. We have a housing crisis. Don't let your housing problem become a crisis. And man, I've been using that quote a lot to put in context what these different costs mean, because the likelihood that people can afford to live in a metropolitan area is starting to be deterministic, right? So you've got to work on this in these different metropolitan areas. If we're going to meet the potential growth capacity, I think we would all want these places to have, because that, tied with office space construction and the will to do that type of development, what our big sector level growth engines are doing, especially technology, I'm going to break down for you in just a few seconds. And it's all related in this idea of what's the real growth potential for you guys. So, you know, at the ARC, we spend a lot of time with ULI. You may in your own communities as well. So I really lean on their information. And this is PricewaterhouseCoopers. But this kind of shocked me. So this is for the technology sector. And I was talking about this with someone earlier. 45% of all the market absorption of the technology sector office space occurred in just 4 areas. And who is now located in 2 of them with a big footprint? Amazon, right? And so this is critical for understanding, like we are continuing to hyper-concentrate these sectors into very particular metropolitan areas. Remember that's why my McKinsey statement at the beginning is so critical. Big winners and everybody else is doing okay, but not winning the lottery ticket of future potential growth. And you guys have to have your ear to the rail at these types of trends. So this is relatively short-term data, but I do think it points pretty accurately towards the future, that these big metropolitan areas that have very strong tech sectors are going to be quite strong going forward. And this is data from Atlanta, and I apologize for that. I'm an Atlanta guy, but I think it sets an expectation as well. We have to build models that think about job growth related to office space consumption, literally. And so one of the sectors that fascinates me is that office and administrative support is a declining sector, and it's really a function of technology. You do most of your calendaring and scheduling and emailing on your own. You really don't depend on support staff for that. And we're really seeing these in our numbers and in the national numbers, and it's just that pressure to not consume as much office space, which is so critical in understanding this intensity of growth. So be aware of that. And be aware of that within the context that realistically, most of the office space that's getting consumed in the United States is still happening in suburban areas, which may or may not be good for your model of how you think you can implement a high-speed rail network. But I do think it's critical that medical office is such a strong footprint. And even in the office market worlds, if you actually read this, they're much more bullish on a medical office than they are on CBD. But there's an interesting point here. There's an unlimited supply of suburban office. So suburban office space rents still are not back to pre-peak numbers. That's what that literally says. Whereas in the CBD, it's up like 58%, something like that. Somebody read it for me, please. Well, that's an incredible difference, and it shows you the dynamic nature of the cores in these metropolitan areas, that's where the business firms that are really leading the United States right now want to be. So that's a positive, I think, all in all. But there's a lot of suburban office space, but the pricing signals are still wrong. Now let's talk about housing affordability. I love this. This is something Zillow put together. It's a Tableau. It's a Tableau chart. I know it looks complicated, but it really tells you the picture of the housing market in the United States. There's one on mortgages. That's why I put mortgage in big caps. And if you see purple out to the right, you know that that's an area where it's just really, really expensive, right? Single family mortgaged housing is very expensive, and there's a wide gap. So if you look at these different places, you'll see very different pictures. Like Houston's price point differential, the share you have to spend for your mortgage is very narrow. But if you look at a Charlotte, there is a huge difference in Charlotte now between an urban house and a rural house, right? The amount you're going to have to pay for those two different products is fundamentally different. And it shows that Charlotte's actually doing quite well. Downtown Charlotte, South Side, tons of engineering firms are located in Charlotte. Charlotte's strong, right? We're all paying attention to Nashville, but I can see that in these numbers, right? I'm just showing you how to look at them so you understand what I see when I look at this. Now, if you look at this compared to if you're renting, look at Los Angeles. There's no difference. It's more expensive in their suburban areas to rent because they have limited supply than it is in the urban areas where they don't actually have as much because they're not as built. But again, it's the same kind of picture where you see, if you look at San Jose, it costs more in suburban areas to rent than it does in their classified urban areas. That's absolutely fascinating. It shows you the challenge that a San Jose really has on the housing side and sets a marker for what kind of solution. So you're talking about high-speed rail, you have to be talking about housing construction as well long-term, right? It all is working together. So just a map to show you against historic averages for different metropolitan areas that some of these places are really out of control. Right, and we have a good friend who works for Wells Fargo. She makes bank. She's a VP. She lives an hour and a half away from San Francisco and commutes every day. and she makes a lot more than we do. There are big struggles in these areas, and we're waiting for the tipping point where it starts to benefit mid-sized metropolitan areas, but Amazon made a decision to go into core areas as well, so you're still seeing them focused on those big metropolitan areas. The last thing I'd say, and it's a plug for the way you're thinking about policy, what we've been doing at the ARC that's been copied by other metropolitan planning organizations is leveraging our transportation dollars to incentivize our local governments to do land use focused plans to get at this idea of making our centers stronger. And we've had a lot of success for this. We have 2 really strong TOD developments that are under construction right now, where we flex funds from federal highway over to FTA pots of money so we could help fund bus and transit infrastructure to change the capital stack for residential development on MARTA properties, right? So I've been out talking nationally about this as an innovative model of development. But again, I'm only saying this to say, you want to talk about last mile connectivity and making sure people have a place to go if they ride your trains when they finish their destination, you've got to work on this as well, that pattern is so critical, that local serving transit, and it has to be matched by good housing policy so there are people that can easily access, that's accessible for them to use these transit resources. So with that, I think I'm right on time. Take any questions you might have. Hopefully I've entertained you a little bit.
We have about 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions out there? Anybody?
So from all your data, it looks like the place to be is Pittsburgh. Why? I mean, are younger people, the jobs are there and the urban amenities are there. Are people moving there but just not enough to replace the people that are dying?
I think you said that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple function, right? That's the case. I never like to say people are dying. I have other aging charts where I talk about people who are no longer with us, because I sincerely want to be kind about that as much as I can. But that really is a fundamental issue, right? And it's in the U.S. It's not the same story as you have in Italy, where you'll read a story in the New York Times about cities offering to give people housing if they'll move to these rural, declining, small cities. But that's very much the case. Pittsburgh's doing great. I wouldn't want you to think anything else. But the actual population growth just isn't there, right? And that's the conundrum of these places that I think have turned an economic corner. But just simple demographics. It doesn't have to be all these fancy generational compositions, psychographic structures. It's just births, deaths, and migration is really what we need to focus on. And I think at the national level, this gets to be critical, because if you really want to maintain the GDP numbers that we'd like to see, the old goal of 3%, 70% of GDP is consumption, and that means people. So if you're not growing that population base, you can't expect your GDP to grow. It's just that simple.
I have sort of a follow-up question on the aging factor. I mean, and especially as it relates to rail planning and what we're talking about today.
Okay.
What we're talking about today. When you look at an aging population, what happens to the income of that population and the ability and interest in travel of that population? Because clearly with public transportation, there's that need to actually keep aging populations who may not be driving as much mobile via public transit or even intercity and high-speed rail. But do they have the income that can actually afford that and the desire to travel? Could you comment on that?
I can absolutely comment on that. I feel like that's a lob. I need to write you a check. So we have had amazing staff. We run the area agency on aging at the ARC where I work. And of course, we've done a lot of planning around that. We actually ran our REMI input-output economic model that we use to make our forecast to look at retaining our older residents so that they don't migrate away, and what the economic benefit of that. And it was actually huge. That spending is so critical to our economy. Someone migrating in an older income group that comes in retired to your metropolitan area is better economically for you than a young person that's competing for jobs. So we talked a lot about that in Atlanta. because we want to capture that spending. We've rebuilt a lot of our planning to focus on retain your older residents because it's critical for your economy. We want every dollar. I'm a big leakage guy, and that's a terrible word, but I want to keep all that money in metropolitan Atlanta, and I spend a lot of time thinking about that. On mobility, it's funny, I put in the back of this deck some of our mobility slides. Well, I deleted them, but you know, you're going to outlive your ability to drive by 7 years. And so when we think about autonomous vehicles and all the other conversations we're having, this is a critical thing for the U.S. We're going to have a larger, older population, and their mobility is going to be fundamentally different. I don't know much about travel characteristics for people that are retired, but generally thinking, you know, comfortable accommodations, which is why I was asking about the high-speed rail in Japan last night at dinner, I think is definitely something that they look forward to. So hopefully that'll be there in these large numbers. They're going to be much more comfortable. That's the subtext without fact of what I'm saying.
If you're not doing anything this afternoon, would you mind walking down to the White House and showing these numbers to the folks down there? Because one thing you didn't mention, this has huge implications for our immigration policy. And are the people at the NEC actually thinking about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I try to stay with this. There's a whole world of economists that I do try to pay attention to. I'm not really a demographer, I'm not really an economist, but I try to pay attention to it. And I think the modeling work on U.S. GDP potential and what the scenarios of economic growth, I can pull those decks out for you. It's something I have been following pretty closely. And we would certainly hope that that's a real conversation. And I don't get into politics, but we need to be at least calculating the numbers to see what it really means, right? So it's a great point, and something, it's why we end up, and this deck is formatted that way.
So on the similar note, the immigration views at one end of the spectrum is the Trump base, and the other end of the spectrum is a lot of the economic writers that you read in Barron's who are looking at the economic implications. So I guess my question was going to be, I think you just answered it, but I just add one point about 7 years outliving your ability to drive. My in-laws live 3 doors down the street. They've long outlived their ability to drive. They still have a car that their offspring drive for them.
Yes, and I truthfully have done that. That's very personal to me. I've taken away keys from 3 people that can no longer drive, and my grandfather literally went George Jones on me. I was riding around to the little hopping shop on his lawnmower. And I'm like, I had to take the keys away from the lawnmower. So when I put that up there, that's very real. And we laugh about it, but when you have that responsibility, you understand what a challenge that is, right? Because we did a survey at the ARC years ago. What will you do if you can no longer drive? How will you get around? And 57% of the people in the survey said somebody else will drive me. And of course, I'm like, who? I'm working. I'm here in D.C. speaking to you. I can't be taking my parents around anymore. So it's a real critical issue. And this is part of the system we need in the United States to meet that challenge.
Can I stand up? We have to wrap up here, but I'm going to take advantage of being the moderator. I'd like to engage maybe Peter Pizer or maybe Chris Brady and some of our government relations folks here on the issue around aging and growth in the United States, where we're densifying and the growth is happening obviously in the metro centers, and we're losing growth in the middle of the country. But that middle of the country, right, still gets 2 senators each in terms of how they're voting. And so the voting power dynamics associated with these demographic changes is going to impact our ability to how our federal government supports and invests in some of the things we're most interested in. I wonder if any of you have a comment about that, about how that dynamic is going to change the political future, and is there anything we can do to change it?
Well, since you called me out, Peter, I'm going to first of all say this is a great lead-in to the 10 o'clock panel. So thank you. That was genius. I think it is changing. The dynamics are changing, and I think this presentation sort of gives us a way to look ahead and see how they're going to continue to change. I think we do have this thing, as you said, called the United States Senate, which is a very undemocratic institution, which lags a little bit therefore, in how it responds to things like this. But I think the opportunity to build support in certain geographic areas and get elected officials from those areas engaged, and certainly Atlanta does a great job of doing that at the regional council table. I mean, that's going to be key to the success here in Washington. And that's what our 10 o'clock panel is about.
Okay, great. Chris, you have a say? Otherwise, we'll wrap up here. Yeah.
I really enjoyed Mike's presentation, and I think if you take what you saw there and you juxtapose it on what we saw in our most recent election, you can see evidence of how these changes are happening, and in many cases, they're happening more rapidly than we thought they would. We're both from Georgia, Mike and I are, and we see certain districts and how the demographics were changing, and we thought those changes would come in 2022, 2024, and they came in 2018. Right. And so you see now a Senate in the committees of jurisdiction for our issues. And this is not new, but one chaired by a guy from South Dakota, one chaired by a guy from Wyoming, and where the projects of national significance are. I think Mike's presentation bore out what's happening in the country. Dallas to Houston, bright blue, right? In the middle, bright red. Okay, California, Northeast Corridor. So I would encourage everybody to sort of take what Mike presented and go back and read the post-election results, and you'll get an idea of what our challenges are going to be, pitching our idea, our ideas when we come together with this policy to a group that may not be as aware of the changes that are happening, as Karen pointed out, and as Mike has certainly demonstrated. So we got a big challenge on our hands.
Work ahead of us. Right. Well, thank you very much, Mike. That was a fantastic presentation.